So I've been really looking forward to this episode. It's a really meaty topic. We've got kind of the social and the political climate is getting more complicated, more divided, whether it's Trump or Gaza, climate change, so-called wokeism, just a few examples. But it's spilling over into the workplace. And, with misinformation spreading fast, online echo chambers reinforcing people's beliefs and trust in traditional institutions fading, employees are tending to come to work with very different and often conflicting viewpoints. And for employers and HR teams, this growing polarization makes it much harder to maintain a cohesive, respectful environment. It's tougher to encourage open communication. Tensions can quickly escalate, and that can lead to conflict, disengagement, or even people leaving the organization. If it's not managed well, this can impact team dynamics, productivity, and the overall culture. So with me to discuss these very meaty issues and to offer her insights is Adele Holliday-Quinn, who is the Chief Leadership Psychologist and founder of the Centre for Leadership Psychology. Welcome, Adele.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. But before we get into these very challenging topics, can you just explain a little bit more about what you do and how did you get to do what you do now?
Sure. So I'm an occupational psychologist by trade, and I've really spent my whole career focusing largely on leadership, so on leadership capability. I've worked for PwC. I've worked for Citibank as an SVP there, focusing around leadership. And my work has always been on looking at what are the innovative and cutting edge ways that we need to be thinking about in how we develop our leaders so that we can continue to be successful as an organization in the future. I'm doing my doctorate in crisis leadership. And what I'm really curious about is what does it mean to be a leader in the world today? What are the crises that we are going to have to continue to manage? And how can we solve for these crises? What are the things that we can do within our organizations to help solve for broader global crises? So that's really what I'm passionate about and what I'll be talking about today.
And do you think it's getting tougher for leaders, or has it always been tough and it's just that we kind of recognize it more?
I think it probably is tougher for leaders. I think there's a lot of pressure, not just on delivering value internally, but broadly, what is your place in the world? How are you solving for climate? How are you thinking about these things in your in your value chains in a way that maybe we haven't had to do before? So, in addition to being an inspirational leader, engaging your teams and delivering, there's a lot more expected, I think, of leaders today than ever before. And
I'm always very conscious when HR is doing something around well-being and you see leaders' faces that they're this sort of panic, that, oh my God, I'm supposed to be a psychologist. I'm supposed to understand about these elements that, excuse me, I'll record that again. I'm always really conscious that when HR is doing something around well-being, and you see the kind of panic in leaders' eyes, it's like, oh my God, am I expected to be a psychologist, a doctor? Shouldn't all these human emotions just be kept out of the workplace? And of course, they are expected to be thinking much more holistically about the human condition and the issues that their people might be facing in a way that they definitely weren't a few years ago.
And there was a time, I think, when the workplace felt really separate, I think, from the broader world and the big debates happening out there. I think that time is over now. So the complexity of the outside world is kind of embedded in our work in a way that hasn't been before. And leaders are really feeling that heaviness.
Let's kind of dive into the topic for today then. I often thank my lucky stars that I'm not in frontline HR anymore. And one of the reasons for this is that when I was a practicing HR director, this issue of the kind of outside world, the political and social tensions, the polarization, just kind of, it really wasn't on the agenda. It wasn't something that we particularly talked about. we just weren't really worrying about kind of resulting tensions amongst employees. Why do you think this has become more of an issue now? Because there were polarization of views, but why has it become a workplace issue?
Mm. Yeah, I think with as political divides and global conflict and identity movements, these were just social issues, but they've really become organizational issues. And for me, I think at the heart of that is polarization. And for anyone who's unfamiliar with that term, it's essentially the kind of growing distance between people's beliefs and values and their worldviews. So it's not just that we disagree more than we have before, it's that we're disagreeing much more intensely. And what we're seeing is there's a lot less tolerance for those who see the world differently to us. And that's a really growing emotional divide. And it's showing, we are more connected than we've ever been before with social media. And because of that, it's showing up in our day-to-day lives, and maybe it didn't before, as humans. So therefore, that kind of growing emotional divide is showing up in our meetings. It's showing up in our team dynamics. People might be more cautious or they might be more confrontational. They're feeling this pressure to either express or maybe the pressure to stay silent. And actually, I think it's really interesting for HR because we're kind of maybe being asked to be a peacekeeper or a coach and kind of a guardian of culture all at once. I think the other key piece of this is around authenticity. So we've spent years talking about bringing your whole self to work, which is a
Yeah.
really lovely sentiment. But I think in some ways we misunderstand that
Yeah,
sentiment. So
it's like we don't really want the whole self. The whole self is actually quite unpleasant. Can you leave bits of it at home? That's interesting. Actually, we're right. What we meant was to kind of bring your experiences and your personalities, but we didn't want you to bring all the conflict that goes with that.
absolutely. And I think when we think about it, how we think about authenticity is probably not the right way to think about it in work, because what it really means is a real way, and that's relational. So when I often think about it at work, it should be about contextual authenticity. So you can be yourself, but you need to also understand and respect the dynamics around you. So, for HR, that might mean creating conditions where people feel safe enough to be honest and vulnerable, but there needs to be boundaries there in how that authenticity shows up. So we've kind of created this problem for ourselves a little bit, but not in a negative way, because we know there's a lot of positivity in there being different perspectives, absolutely. But it's how we navigate that, how we manage that, and how we avoid it becoming something that's toxic or difficult.
So when you talk about kind of boundaries, putting in boundaries, what might that look like? Because it's difficult, isn't it? You're kind of letting the genie out of the bottle. You're saying it's okay. We want you to be yourself. We want to hear from you. We value this diverse range of perspectives, but they need to be put across in this way or phrased that way. Is that the kind of thing that you mean in terms of being HR, being able to help with that, giving guidance to leaders around what those guardrails might look like? Have you kind of got any examples of those kind of boundaries or guardrails?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to accept it's inevitable, first of all. I think that's really important, because when you're bringing people together from different backgrounds and beliefs and identities, and we're encouraging them to be themselves, we're going to get conflict. The challenge we have is, how do we respond? How do we create those boundaries? And I think our instinct is to shut things down quickly or treat something as a compliance issue if we feel like something has crossed a boundary. But we might want to think about things like restorative practice. Um,
Can
this
you
is
explain what that means?
Yeah, it's something Ben and Jerry's do actually really, really well. And it's this structured way of bringing people together where you will explore harm and acknowledge impact, and you'll find a way forward. So Ben and Jerry's have created these forums where people have these difficult conversations in a way that aligns to their values without escalating, but also without avoiding it. And then the boundary pieces, we need to have really good clarity on our non-negotiables and not be shy about those. So people need to know the lines. At what point does a personal view become a values violation? At what point does an expression become exclusion? And HR needs to be really clear about that, about what's tolerated, but also what's not. And that will allow trust, that will build trust. But it's not an easy thing to do, right? And we have to start investing in this space in a way that we just haven't before, really being very clear on what our non-negotiables are. And our purpose should help us with that, really kind of getting our anchoring ourselves in purpose. I think the other thing is important to recognize is about identity fatigue. So this is a sense that people, especially those in underrepresented groups, they can feel pressure to constantly perform their identity.
Yeah.
Being authentic should also mean having a choice not to explain or defend who you are every day. And I think true inclusion will allow for this. It'll allow for the voice and it'll allow for the privacy. And that's the balance that we want to try to achieve by creating those boundaries.
So, thinking about how we help managers and leaders to cope with very polarized views in their teams, if they're sensing that there is a kind of high level of antagonism, or there are what they would deem to see as inappropriate comments, what would you suggest leaders and managers do? And clearly HR can play a role in this to kind of help navigate teams working together whilst retaining their identity, their views, as you say, not shutting it down, but allowing for that dialogue. What would you say the kind of practical strategies that can help with this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think at a broad kind of contextual perspective, the most powerful tool, and we've seen this, is helping teams to be re-anchored in shared purpose. So when people feel pulled apart by ideology or identity, you want to bring them back to why are we actually here? And that can be really grounding. So what are we actually trying to achieve together? What do we value collectively? And asking those questions and revisiting those, I think, is really, really important. But also in the day-to-day can be really hard as a manager if you're coming up against these and you're not too sure, how do I navigate this? So we do need to really build out managers' capability around managing conflict and just building up our fluency around conflict, because I've been doing management development for years, but I haven't spent a huge amount of time training managers to manage this kind of tension. Because what they need to learn is how do you stop defaulting to avoidance? How do you stop defaulting to shutdown? What are the micro skills? How do I ask a curious question instead of a defensive one? How
Can
do
you
I?
give me an example of what you would mean by a curious question rather than a defensive question?
Yeah, so you might, maybe not a question, but you might want to say, I'm not sure I agree, but I'm open to understanding. So rather than saying, well, that's just not how we do it here, tell me more about that. Tell me more why that's a concern of yours. So being curious is, for me, just a fantastic leadership trait. For me, it really is a differentiator between great leaders and exceptional leaders. And that applies to everything, including things like managing conflict. Can you reframe your language? What is it
Yeah,
you
and
want
that's so
to?
hard for leaders to do. I was talking to somebody about this the other day because, I think it was EY who did some analysis of the higher performing teams, and they looked at, what was it that the leaders did differently in the higher performing teams against the average or the poorer performing teams. And actually there weren't massive amounts of differences, but there was one constant. And that was that the leaders of the higher performing teams asked great questions. That so they kind of developed this mindset, which is lead with questions.
The
And it's
curiosity.
so hard, if you're a very kind of red leader, like I am, very task oriented, very kind of like, come on, let's do it, very action oriented, just trying to pause and ask a question before you get into your default conversational style. Just that kind of helping leaders with those kind of, and I think HR can be very practical here.
Mm.
Instead of saying this, ask that. Those kind of nudges, those little prompts and suggestions, can be very, very helpful for managers. And I think you're right. I think that kind of not listening, not asking questions to shut things down, but asking questions to genuinely understand and to probe and to open it up.
And I think timing is important with this. And I think, partly why we're talking about this today is that managers are going to be feeling this now. I certainly had this, in my previous role. I had things come up about unconscious bias, and I thought, oh, I don't know how. I believe this exists, but someone who's based in another country and they've got a different perspective and they have more debate around these ideas and topics. Well, how do I have this conversation? Because this is who we are, but actually your perspective is different. And we do, I think, need to be on the front foot with this, with helping managers manage this, because also it's a risk to the organization. So we need to start thinking about this now. And I think courage is a part of it. We talk a lot about creating safe spaces. We want safe spaces, but brave spaces are just as important, right? We need to be able to allow people to speak up and manage that well, even if it's uncomfortable. So that we're all agreeing to do it respectively, but with structure. And if we're on the front foot with that, and we're thinking about that now, that will only enable us to manage it in the best possible
I
way.
think that's absolutely right. They're kind of courageous conversations. I think it was Bank of America who described their approach to some of the sort of DEI conversations they were having. They kind of labeled it that kind of courageous conversations, because you, as a leader or a manager, you're kicking something off. You're not entirely sure whether there's going to be huge amounts of emotion associated with this. You're frightened of the language and getting it wrong. And so I think that kind of sense of, don't shut it down, be brave, step into it, be clear of your guardrails, but recognize that you shouldn't be avoiding it. And the more that you are on the front foot with this as a leader and a manager, the better it will be. Is that a kind of fair summation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think HR really need to help, be partners with that, be proactive partners in that capability building, because you just don't want this conflict to start to escalate. We need to be ready for it in real time. How do I handle that political comment that's going to potentially derail a meeting? And how do I respond when someone challenges my leadership based on my values? Um, so I would recommend that we look at our listening systems as well around that. How are you listening to your
Can you
organization?
just explain what you mean by a listening system?
So are you doing pulse surveys, engagement surveys? How are you gathering data on what people are thinking and feeling? Are you deep diving into some of those surveys and having some sessions where you're getting facilitated conversations, team retrospectives, because a lot of polarization is silent until it explodes. So it might just be happening away without you really recognizing. If you need to catch it early. And I think part of that is being able to define early on, how do we want a team to work together? So not just what we do, but how do we relate? What are our shared behavioral agreements? And that will go a long way in reducing friction and giving people a kind of framework to really fall back on, because we don't want to stop the diverse thinking, because we know that's an advantage for us in terms of performance and all sorts of things. But in teams, it only works in teams that feel safe. So if we don't have that psychological safety, then that diversity will become threatening. People will experience it as a threat.
So
But
talk to me a bit about psychological safety, because perhaps not all our listeners will be familiar with the term. It's being used quite a lot in employment circles, in HR. And there are huge benefits to creating an environment where people feel psychologically safe. But can you just kind of define it, how your version of what psychological safety looks like?
yeah, absolutely. The language, I think, is a little divisive because it's a little intellectual sounding, psychological safety. But I think at a really basic level, it's just the idea that employees will feel safe within the context when they're working, and that safety will allow them to um, be really clear on their perspectives, maybe challenge other perspectives, raise their voice when they want to, be open-minded to change, and it allows them to be more innovative because they're more likely to take a chance. They'll manage risks better. So it really allows them to feel like, okay, I'm going to be able to raise a concern here that can manage a risk because I know it won't get shut down. I feel that safety within my team. And we know there's a huge amount of evidence for how impactful it can be to have a team where people do feel psychologically safe. And this goes back a little bit to the authenticity, to kind of to be themselves, to be themselves in the organization, to feel like they can bring part of themselves to work. And it's hugely, hugely impactful. And it really, for me, it's the core out of a lot of this. If you have psychological safety, it will enable you to manage this much, much better than if you have a team that doesn't feel psychologically safe. It's at the core of a lot of this work. So if you can build psychological safety in your team, it will enable you to navigate and manage all of this complexity in a much, much better way.
A lady I used to work with, she always used to kind of frame team dynamics in the, she used to talk about it's like a flat share. When you kind of maybe left home or you went to university, and you had a flat share, it's like you wouldn't necessarily you wouldn't have chosen to share a house or a flat with these people, but you are. And they're going to have different experiences and different backgrounds. And some of them will leave the top off the milk, and some of them won't tidy up, and some of them will behave differently to you, but somehow you've got to get along. And I think, that kind of sense of where is it important to have ground rules around behavior, but at the same time allowing people some degree of freedom to live their lives and to be themselves. That's kind of where we're trying to help leaders get to. And there's no manual for this, is there? There's no just do steps 1 to 5 and it'll all be fine. It is grey, it is dirty sometimes, it is uncomfortable. But those leaders who are able to at least surface some of these issues, discuss them, and get them people engaging with it's definitely going to help them rather than suppressing. Because I like what you said, that it's silent until it isn't, and then it becomes a problem. I think one of those areas where people have historically felt anxious about saying the wrong thing, engaging in a debate, has been DEI. We did a podcast a little while ago about, the kind of the reaction from the Trump administration and some of the post announcement executive orders, chief execs rolling back on DEI commitments. And our position from Disruptive HR was that, yeah, some of it might be blatant opportunism to get rid of some commitments that they didn't believe in the first place. But actually, there are some issues with DEI as a kind of a movement that perhaps has created some level of alienation, conflict, tension, shaming, etc. And I think this is one of those areas where actually, DEI has become a bit of a flashpoint. Increasing skepticism, legal challenges. But at the same time, we know that DEI is really important and is vital to organizations. How would you see it would be important for HR teams or organizations to adapt or rethink their approach to inclusion in the kind of current climate? Should they be doing that, or should they just hold strong despite global pressures to shift focus? What would your advice be to organizations who are perhaps pausing and saying, should we rethink our approach to DEI?
Yeah, it's such an interesting topic because in itself, it's so polarizing. Even in HR, when I talk to HR colleagues about DEI, some people don't feel comfortable or know the words to use to talk about what they like about it, what they don't like about it, what they think works, what they don't think works. So in itself, it's such a complex topic.
It's so true. Even as I introduce it into conversations like just now, I feel my stomach knotting because I'm very conscious that things I might say might, without any intent on my part, might be, offensive to some or not going far enough for others. And it does feel like one of those areas, ironically, which is incredibly alienating. It's like inclusion is the most alienating part of what we do in HR. And it's like, it shouldn't be this way.
No, and we shouldn't feel shy to say that, because I think that's where we failed with DEI. And it's not the blame on the DEI team. It's because all of HR have to do this together. None of these things work in isolation. So it's where I think we failed, with it, that we are still feeling this incredible tension just talking about it.
Yeah.
We all done work in this space, whether directly or indirectly, but we are seeing such a clear shift, right? I think the push is from away from the symbolic DEI, because I think that's where we struggle, to needing to be much more strategic and have embedded inclusion. The language is evolving, the delivery is evolving, but the intention change. I think we just need to do it differently. The how needs to change, but at the core of it, that intention needs to stay the same. And I don't think organizations should back down. I think they need to, we've spent years, exploring these kind of evidence-based practices that we build in HR, and we should feel really proud of that. But I do think we need to reframe it. So less emphasis on optics, more emphasis on fairness, dignity, psychological safety. We want much less performative allyship and much more everyday accountability. So for me, I think they should hold strong, but they have to evolve the how.
When you say performative allyship, what would you mean?
I think just more, organizations investing in DEI, or saying they're investing in DEI, and then some other practices just not really aligning with that.
Mm.
So saying what you're going to do and actually do it, or mean it. If this is something that you say is a value, then mean that. And if it doesn't feel like a value, why not? How can you get it to a place where it actually is? It does feel meaningful, and it doesn't feel like a scary thing to talk about for people who are in HR.
Yeah,
Not.
exactly. You think if we're scared, what help has the rest of the organization got? I couldn't agree with you more. I think those organizations who have appeared to just row back on DEI without really reframing it and recommitting, I think are going to have real problems further down the line if the political climate shifts again, and their staff will be saying, well, where the hell were you? It's the first sign of trouble, then you kind of abandon the DEI ship. However, I think those organizations that say, look, this is a fantastic opportunity to recommit and to say, why has it failed? In which case, it's not that the intent was wrong. It's that the practices didn't support it effectively. And there are lots of things that we're seeing, using nudge-based approaches, using AI and technology to help take the human out of the equation, using the conversation, just as you described earlier, but reframing those conversations in a way where everybody feels they can have a role, make it less about minority groups and more about a broader inclusion. So I think that that can be this could be so exciting for DEI if we take that opportunity.
I agree. And I think it's at the heart of that polarization, because if we can really refocus it on what it needs to be, which is about, away from this identity only model and into, belonging, which is built through our experience, how decisions are made, how people are listened to, how difference is actually treated, that will really enable us to manage polarization much better, because it will
Yeah.
bring us back to these, our core universal values, our, fairness, trust, dignity, psychological safety. These are things everybody wants, regardless of your belief system. And that's ultimately how we're going to build bridges instead of walls, which is really key for how we look at DI going forward, I think.
So just to wrap things up and kind of bring us full circle back to where we started, if let's say a manager's listening to this and they've got a team and somebody in the team is causing real issues because of their strong either political or environmental beliefs, but is really causing some trouble because people are feeling that that they're being shouted down, or that they don't feel they can speak up, or they just disagree but don't quite know how to handle it, and so maybe there's some tensions arising. What would you say to that manager? What would be the first things they should think about doing?
Um, I think it's something about managing. It's not either or. I think it's both. So I think we can create space for people to reflect and learn and make it clear that some behaviors aren't okay. So I think we can do both, but from a behavioral psychology standpoint, people need clarity. They need to understand consequence, but they also need support. So I think rather than punishment, we need to think about restorative work here, restorative conversations, helping someone understand their impact, not just their intention, and being really clear on the organizational non-negotiables is so important, because ultimately that will protect the psychological safety for everyone. But it is difficult. It is a complex place to be, and I would say reach out and try to build your own capability around managing conflict, and that will really set you up for success with managing these conversations. Not to shy away from them, to be open and curious about them as and when they come up.
Thanks, Adele. Let's wrap that up there. It's been fascinating talking to you. Thank you so much for joining me today. Where can people reach you?
They can reach me via my website, which is clpsychology.co.uk.
And we'll put that in the show notes for the podcast when it comes out. Thanks again, Adele. Thank you so much for joining us, and thanks everyone for listening. Hi, I hope you found this useful. If you'd like more videos like this, then make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications.